Hi, everybody. Kevin Hillstrom here for our next installment about merchandise dynamics. Hi. Today we're going to talk about what is called the class of report. So, in a lot of my project work, um, you get a call, you do a Zoom, there's some underlying business problem. People are very rarely honest about what the business problem is. If they are honest about it, it really helps us get to a solution a lot quicker. But for the most part, they're pretty vague about what the business problem is. So, one of the first things I will run when I'm performing a merchandise dynamics project is what I call a class of report. So, the goal here is to identify items that were introduced in different years. So, if an item was introduced to your business 0 to 12 months ago, that's one merchandise class. If an item was introduced 13 to 24 months ago, that is a separate class of merchandise. If an item was introduced 25 to 36 months ago, that's also a separate class. Items introduced 37 to 48 months ago are another class. And then I take all the old items and I generally lump them all together. And they're just basically old items. We'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about why those items are important as well. But I want to see what the merchandising team has done to influence the trajectory of the business over the course of the past 4 years. In most of my project work, if a business is not meeting its expectations, it is not meeting expectations because of merchandising problems. It is pretty rare for a business to struggle because the business doesn't really get enough new customers because marketing failed. Marketing knows if marketing needs enough new customers generally to succeed. Marketing is really good at understanding how profitable their new customer acquisition efforts are, and so they're going to spend to a certain target. And so generally, if there's not enough new customers, it's because they can't acquire customers profitably. And the reason marketers cannot acquire customers profitably is because the merchandise the brand is selling is not compelling enough to cause enough customers to purchase to cause the marketing to be successful. So I have to dig in and find out what is going on with different merchandise classes as a very first step. So I have found that the table that I have included here on this slide is typically the most important table I look at. I will look at this table for the business in total, and then I break this up by merchandise categories. And I take a look at how different merchandise categories are performing as well. This table can be run for different price points. It can be run for different divisions, departments, categories, like I mentioned earlier. You can divide this up however you like. I like to look overall first, and then I drill down from there. So here I'm looking overall at different classes of merchandise. I see in total, it says totals. There's a row there, it says totals. If you read across it, that's sales for each of the past 5 years. $3.3 million, down to $3.1 million, down to $2.5 million, down to $2.4 million, and then flat at $2.4 million. So this business is struggling. It is not generating enough volume here within this category. I mentioned earlier I was starting at the total business. I was incorrect. I'm looking at a category here. So within this category, I like to look next at the number of items that were introduced by year. And I see that 3 to 4 years ago, this brand introduced 103 items. 2 to 3 years ago, it introduced only 77 items. And then in the past 2 years, it introduced 104 items each within this category. So I look across that row where I see 77 new items introduced. And I see that 2 years ago for that class, those new items, those 77 new items, generated $331,000. If I go to the year before that, when there was 103 items, it generated $548,482. The year after that, when there's 104 items, we generated $816,917. So something happened 2 to 3 years ago where the merchandising team failed to introduce enough new items. Sales suffered. Now, read across that row for a minute. So you see $331,440 generated from new items that were introduced 2 to 3 years ago in their first year. In their second year, it's $295,842. This is sort of like doing an eye test for me. And then in the past year, $185,500. So one of the things I want to point out is when you have a bad year for new items, that bad year stays with you going forward. So in this case here, the brand lost between $250,000 and $500,000 by having a bad year of new merchandise, and the brand keeps losing $200,000 to maybe $400,000 in subsequent years. So when you have a bad year, the only way you make up for it is by having a good year. So you are going to struggle when you have a bad year. I had a client that they hired a new CEO. The new CEO hired a new chief merchandising officer. This brand sold the same type of merchandise for the past 30 years. They sold the same stuff over and over again. The new leadership team thought that what they were selling was boring and needed to be greatly updated. The new leadership team discontinued what was being sold and introduced too few new items that customers didn't like. And so the result looked a lot like this table here. The sales from the new items were terrible. Let's go to the old items in this table. Old items 4 years ago generated $3.3 million, 3 years ago $2.6 million, and then $1.7 million 2 years ago. So this brand was actively cutting off old items and not selling them anymore. You can see it clearly from the table. It's unlikely that these new items perform poorly and we're stopped. The new items in all likelihood the old items in all likelihood were just items that the brand didn't like, or the merchandising person didn't like, or the CEO didn't like, and they just decided to discontinue them. When you discontinue items, you don't generate the sales from those items going forward. And so you have to have something to replace those items in order to be successful. So in this case here, you can see that the brand is just hemorrhaging sales from old items. And the brand is not generating enough sales from new items to make up for it until we get to 1 year ago. Between 1 and 2 years ago, the brand introduced 104 new items, and they generated $816,917. So this is a case where the brand figured out, or somebody in merchandising figured out that this business was struggling and needed some newness. And they started introducing enough new items, and the business started turning around. And by turning around here, in this case, I mean it flattened out. This business went from $3.3 million, I should say, 4 years ago, down to $3.1 million, down to $2.5 million. When they started introducing enough new items, they stopped the bleeding and the business stabilized. The business here for this category is still not where it needs to be, but somebody with new items made some changes here. We can see in the percentage new row, about 2/3 of the way down the table, that this brand generated 18% of its volume in this category from new items 3 years ago. 2 years ago, it was 13.5%. And then all of a sudden, a year ago, it's 33.5%. And in the past year, 29.6%. So somebody got religion, figured out what was going on. And as a result, they decided to make some changes. And now we have enough new items to stop this business from shrinking. If we go down towards the bottom portion of the table, we can see what the average price is of items that were sold for new items and existing items. And we see an interesting change, don't we? So look at new items. 3 years ago, it's $136 per new item. 2 years ago, it's $115. 1 year ago, $180. So even though this brand got religion and figured out they needed new items or new merchandise, how they're getting to it, or how they're getting to a sales that are stabilizing with a sales increase for new items, how they're getting there is by selling items that are more expensive. So this always has interesting dynamics that play out over time. So you don't really know what this is going to look like now when you make the decision, but over time it means that you're bringing on customers now who have different expectations for your brand. New items in the past year cost $200.64. Now let's compare that to existing items. 4 years ago, new items were $136, existing items were $111. 2 years ago, new items were $115, existing items were $106. 1 year ago, new items were $180, existing items $94. And as of today, new items are $201, existing items are $92. So somebody in the merchandising team has a vision for this category that is different from the historical perspective that customers got looking at this category. Somebody has decided that this department or this category, if they want it to be successful, needs to have a higher price point and be selling items that cost more. The items that exist are generally items that are less expensive. And so the average price of an item sold is actually not changing a whole lot. It's just not changing a whole lot. In total, on average, if you go back 2 years ago, it was $107. Then it was $111 last year, $112. This year, $110. So this brand is making some changes with their pricing, and we're going to have to see how that turns out over time. So this reporting framework helps me see what's going on. There's probably 3 key takeaways I get from this report. Somebody is discontinuing old items, and I would have to now do a subsequent analysis to look at how these winning items that were older items, are they being carried over or not? And if the items are being carried over and are performing poorly, then the items are just dying. But I really want to see if the brand is focusing on discontinuing items, and that's causing a sales shortfall. So that's the first thing I want to see. The second thing is that I'm kind of happy about is there is a renewed focus on new merchandise. And it appears, for the third point I want to look at here, it appears that the new items that are being introduced are at a much higher price point than the existing items that are being sold. That's going to help me now drill down into pricing dynamics and understanding if customers truly like these higher price points or they like lower price points. Who has better future value? A customer who buys one $200 item or a customer who buys two $100 items? I want to see those things. So this is how I use the class of report as a starting point to understand how a brand is either succeeding or failing with their merchandising efforts. So let's stop there. If you have any questions, you can email me at kevinh@mindthedata.com, and we will pick this up again next week with another topic. So thank you all for following along.